With the rise of France's Louis XIV and Russia's Peter the Great during the 15th and 17th centuries, kings and monarchies increased in power while nobles and aristocracies fell behind. This was due to the fact that Louis XIV and Peter the Great tamed and corralled their nobility to a point in which those nobles had little to no influence anywhere. However, in the 18th century, aristocracies began to reassert themselves in the political and social scenes of their countries. The old regime was an era in France prior to 1789 and exemplified the aristocratic revolution. It was characterized by extremely powerful aristocratic elites, established churches, an urban labor force, and a rural peasantry which was subject to high taxes. Additionally, taxes during the 18th century heavily favored the nobility. French clergy and nobility were considered to be the first and second levels of the old regime and were almost completely tax-exempt. The nobles didn't measure their wealth by acreage, but by rather a number of souls, or male serfs, they owned. At times, they even refused to pay taxes when the entire country was on the cusp of bankruptcy. Instead, they used this illegitimate money to buy political and social power to rule over the highly taxed peasantry, or the third level of the old regime. These peasants made up the majority of the population and engaged mostly in subsistence agriculture, since most of their money was taken by unfair taxes and banalities, or feudal dues. One of these unfair taxes, known as victiam, which resembled an income tax. However, since the nobles didn't pay taxes, the peasants usually carried the brunt of this load. Additionally, the peasants were used for forced manual labor on public works, known as corvées, and in many of the Habsburg Islands, are service called the robot, which required serfs to provide service for their lords with no pay. The nobles were divided into two primary groups, the nobles of the robe and those of the sword. The nobles of the robe were more politically inclined and held government positions, while those of the sword owed knightly services to feudal lords. However, military power in France was increasing during this time, and nobles of the sword became increasingly obsolete. As that progressed, Louis XIV relied on robe nobles more, creating a rivalry between the two noble houses. Russia, on the other hand, efficiently unified the nobility with Catherine the Great's Charter of Nobility. It legally defined noble rights and privileges that heavily favored the first and second classes of the old regime in exchange for assurance that the nobility would serve the state voluntarily. This was a large change from Peter the Great's table of ranks. He mandated noble service, while she was more friendly to the nobles since they propped up her regime. Her friendliness did, however, help cause the rise of aristocracies again due to their freedom. 15th and 18th century Europe were a tumultuous time, and the aristocratic revolution just added to the chaos. Entire social structures were altered, and different ways of life were created. The primary reason the nobles fought back was because the absolutist monarch had all the power while they had very little. Once they re-established themselves in society and regained some of their power, the nobles were appeased. Absolutist monarchies and aristocracies do not mix well, and the aristocratic revolution of the 18th century is a prime example of that.